Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to this panel discussion about data projects. So, the format that we have landed upon is for it to be interactive with all of you. So, I'm going to give you a quick introduction of the speakers on the stage, and they're going to tell something about themselves for a minute, each person. So, the idea is for you to put your questions down in Slido, and if you find other questions that are interesting for you, also vote them up so that I can ask those questions to the panel. It will be an interactive discussion also within the speakers and with the audience participation, yeah? That's our idea. It is a 30-minute panel discussion. Of course, we are not trying to solve all problems under the sun in 30 minutes, but the more interactive you make it, the more beneficial it is for you guys, yeah? So from my right to left, we have Ellissa Verseput, we have Matt Housley, we have Alan Holub, and Flavio Junqueira, sorry about that. And we are going to talk about data projects. So in many companies, depending on the size of the company, they invest a lot of money in new data projects, but what is the outcome? What is the impact of those data projects? Do you see the performance benefits? What kind of impact does it have on the overall business model? Those kinds of, it's an open topic. Those are the basic foundations of this speech. So I would request perhaps you to start, introduce yourself for a minute, and we go through our panel. Yeah?
Let's do it. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So hi, I'm Ellissa. I'm currently the data team lead at a company called Sympower. It's a company in the green energy domain. And I've had various experiences in the past up until now where either I was, as a consultant, just asked to build a particular data thing at a company, or we were more in an innovative setting where basically from a data innovation team, we had to spark new projects for the company, up until the position I'm holding now, where we're basically very pragmatically finding what is best for our company and the customers right now, and what should we automate with data, or what should we use ML for so that we can actually accelerate our products. So yeah, I'm curious for the questions and what we will be discussing.
Thanks, Ellissa. I'm Matt Housley. I co-wrote a book called Fundamentals of Data Engineering, and I also co-founded a consulting company called Ternary Data. And my interest in this topic stems from two things. First of all, data engineering is expensive, both from the human power and technology perspective. And second, when you're a manager and you have payroll, you tend to see payroll, but you don't always see the cost of your projects, depending on how you do the accounting. But when you're a consultant and you hand someone a proposal and there's a big price tag on it, you have to explain to the client why they should even care and why they should spend that money. So we found that these discussions with clients were very important, and I think these are discussions we need to be having in general as we talk to our bosses and our stakeholders.
Alan?
I'm Alan. Hello. Well, I've worn a lot of hats, but the hat I'm wearing up here, which I have just put on, is more the architect and contrarian hat. Is that I've been a CTO a couple times. I've worked in the trenches and written code and done everything in between. And one of the things that I've observed working with data scientists is they're often so focused on the data that they lose track of the business. And I want to be the representative of the business here, I guess.
Flavio?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, I'm Flavio. I guess the boring part of my background is, I have a mix of academic and industry experience. I've been in research labs and in product teams. My background is mostly on distributed systems. I'm mostly known for my Zookeeper work, but the past few years I have been doing some stuff on data as well. I guess the experience that when I was invited to this panel. The experience that I feel is more relevant to this, or most relevant to this, is the one I had with Yahoo. So back in the day, that was back in 2006. So the person leading the research organization at Yahoo realized that the big value that we could provide was to extract information from the data that was helpful for the company. At that point, you wouldn't see a lot of people talking about it. But the thing is, that initial seed led to a whole research organization to work on it, which led to the whole Hadoop ecosystem that you all know, which ended up in a lot of the systems and things that we talk about in conferences like this. So even though that was not one single data project, it all started with okay, so how to extract value of this data that I have, click-throughs and all that stuff, and ended up with a lot of systems and different data projects in the end. So.
All right. So I'm going to pick the questions based on the maximum upvotes that they have so that we know that many people are interested in having those questions answered. So the first one goes here. What will be the difference in approaches to data projects in small company or startup versus a big company on the level of business decisions and overall strategy, for example? Who wants to take this question?
I'll start with it. The biggest difference is that when you are just starting on a product, you don't really need any data at all, at least not in the way we think about it. If you've got 15 customers, you do not need a giant Oracle distro in order to manage one table with 4 columns in it and maybe half a dozen rows, right? Is that a simple in-memory, I'm feeding back, a simple in-memory system will work just fine. And the system will then grow incrementally over time as we talk to our customers and learn more about what the customers need. And then the way the data is represented has to then scale incrementally along with the customer base and the complexity of the program. So one of the key things, I guess I'd say in that situation as you move up, is that you have to be designing both a system and a data architecture that's able to grow incrementally. And if you're not thinking about that from day one, it's going to be very, very hard to do. And if you put too much complexity in at the beginning, you're going to be fighting that complexity instead of getting code out the door and making some money, which from a startup point of view is the top of the list. So you need to keep things as simple as possible for the state that you're in at all times.
Flavio, you had something to add to it, yeah?
Sure. So if we, I guess I've seen both sides of it. So if you're talking about, I'm going to call it small projects. They don't necessarily need to be small, but it's small. I'm referring to like one team developing like one application. The obvious things for me are you have to make sure that you have the data that you need. Okay, and if you don't have, you have to go collect it. Then you have to make sure that it's the appropriate quality for you to extract the results that you need. And then the part that I believe is most difficult, I was actually hoping to hear more from my colleagues here about the metrics, right? So how do you know you have succeeded? Quite frankly, I think I suck at that part on the metrics. If people are happy with it and they're using it, for me, it's a metric of success, but how you quantify it, I don't know. I find it hard in general. I don't have a closed recipe. Then the other side of it is I've seen like large organizations dealing with data problems, like you have different teams generating data and they don't talk to each other and they generate in different ways and they're in different repositories and you end up duplicating. And sometimes you say, well, it's the same data, but then they generate different results because they organize differently. And so that kind of confusion that happens in a complex data scenario that you would see in large companies with an IT organization and different teams doing data stuff is very typical. So I have seen efforts, I guess everyone has heard of stuff like data mesh, data products, right? So there are all these concepts that are supposed to help with that kind of organization, but they're not necessarily easy to implement. A lot of them are actually concepts. There are products that will do everything for you. But if you think along those lines, that that might help with the overall data journey of a large organization.
Yeah, no, I'm going to follow on to that, and actually a lot of what Alan said as well. And that is one of the biggest mistakes I've seen startups make is just overcomplicating systems they're going to build, and in particular, choosing build in the build versus buy conversation. The problem is startups are all inspired by these mega unicorns like Google and Facebook, and they see the story of those companies and say, well, Google invented MapReduce and Facebook invented all this technology in-house. Why don't we do that too? Well, what they're not realizing is that those companies did it because they had to do it. And at this point, if you're a startup, just get it off the shelf when you're starting out. And then as you grow and you have resources and you actually have a business, then it's a different conversation. So large enterprise, it's not always build or buy, but you have a whole different parameter set for making that decision. But when you're small, just focus on the one piece of secret sauce, and most of the other stuff you should buy, from my perspective. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm liking the angle that you're all taking, all a bit more from the architecture, the technical angle. I'm also thinking from my experience, a bit more from the data product angle. What I've seen happening, at least in my experience, is that corporates way too often want to maybe jump too quickly to the full-blown solution, bring it to all the customers without properly testing if maybe it's actually adding value properly. So I've literally had that. We did a small machine learning innovation project. We were very enthusiastic about it, and then we kind of wanted to bring that to 13 similar use cases, but there the ML was simply not working. We didn't have the proper data, the algorithm wasn't working properly, and yeah, it wasn't really a success after all. So basically the product thinking and also the startup thinking of, okay, let's properly test if this data product actually is what the customers are looking for, is also something I think is a big difference. Well, from startup, you sort of have to do it. There's no other way. There's simply no funding otherwise. And the corporate can sometimes skip steps and then, yeah, end up a little bit in a mess.
Yeah, I mean, as you heard from 4 people, one question can be focused from 4 different points of views or, perspectives. And it's always interesting to involve more people to get such insights before we jump into any such projects.
Well, actually, let me throw in something too, is that like us, there are a lot of perspectives that are important within the company that all have to be taken into consideration as you're evolving.
Right? There's the tech perspective, business perspective.
Well, there's there's a tech perspective, there's the business perspective, and then there's the customer perspective. And from a value point of view, if your customers don't think it's value, you do not have a product, which means you do not have a company. So it's essential to be aware of the value equation at every level as you're working through the system, because the value changes, the definition of value changes. And we as programmers all too often don't pay attention to anything except the programming aspect, right? We don't talk to the business people at all. We try to avoid it. We certainly don't talk to the customers. Well, you may or may not, right? In an enlightened company, the devs will talk directly to the customers, but in most larger companies, there's a lot of processes in place to guarantee that a dev cannot talk to a customer, right? So how are we going to get their perspective as to value if we don't do that?
I think the audience is making this very interactive session because I have here tons of questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to move on to the next one so that we can answer as many as possible during this session. So the next most upvoted question is this: how does org structure of a company influence data projects' success or outcomes? Anything you can think of that works and something that doesn't? For example, the org structure of the company.
No, say it again. I didn't.
So how does the organization structure of a company influence data projects' success or failure? Or the outcomes in general?
Let me start. I was lost. So what I'm currently experiencing at Sympower is that it matters a lot how you're organized and also how the teams are composed to make actually data really available to everyone. Basically, this data democratization thing is, I think it's core also how your company is organized to make that actually work. So let's say 2 years ago, maybe the financial team or the sales team, they didn't really have people that were data savvy. So then if we tried to work together with them and do something to give them more data insights, it was a really hard match because, yeah, the skills were not there, the attention was not there, also the focus was not there. But then if you start to organize the structure of the company around it and you also bring more data savvy people into these teams, you can see that, yeah, it's easier to adopt also data solutions, data products easier. And the collaboration across the company becomes easier to, really get to data democratization.
I think that's an excellent point because it's a known term. I'm sure a lot of people here have heard this term before, but in organizations where teams are siloed, they're operating independently. So unless they're doing a project that only affects them, that's going to be a problem overall for the company. But there were references to startups too. So in the startup case in which you don't have large groups, you don't have such a separation across teams, or at least they're not as strong. I would say that the best thing to do is just execute fast and learn from your mistakes and iterate.
There's also Conway's Law issues in here, right? As Conway's Law says that the structure of an organization, or what he said was the communication paths, but that's essentially the same thing. So the structure of the organization is directly reflected in the structure of the architecture that that organization creates. Is that the organizational system will always be reflected in the software system. And all too often, we are not doing that, right? Is that we have an architecture that's at odds with the organizational architecture. And particularly when you have, say, a data silo, in the sense that there's all the data guys and women, and they're in this little room by themselves, and you throw meat under the door twice a week, and the data comes out. Right, and that's not going to work with respect to Conway's Law, because that will always give you a data model that is completely isolated from the reality of the rest of the system. And when the data model gets out of phase with the architectural model and the things that people are trying to accomplish with that data, you have disaster. You have too much complexity, you've got stuff that's hard to maintain, stuff that's hard to change. You really don't want to be in that place.
I'll just address this from one perspective that we see, and that is there's quite often a disconnect between the teams generating the data, so like the software team developing a web app, say, the teams analyzing the data, so say a data science team, and the teams actually consuming that analysis, say business teams. And the consequences of that can be very unfortunate. I mean, you just get lower quality performance at every stage if you have that separation. I was recently reading an article about this like Soviet aircraft manufacturer, Anatov, and Anatov would design planes, and then they would hand the plans to someone else to build, and often they wouldn't build the spec, and this was linked to various crashes, and you see the same thing. And so, if nothing else, having better communication and incentives between those teams will make a big difference, just so software can say, hey, how are you going to use this data, data engineers, and pass that message on, and data engineers can say to software, if you change this schema a bit, like you were saying, it would really make life easier in asking business, what do you actually want to do with this data?
Well, also in that light, the best way to communicate is for everybody to be literally in the same room.
That is
right, and trying to take aspects of data management and putting them to separate groups is almost always going to work against you. What you want is one group that can handle all of the things that need to be handled to solve a specific problem. And if you start splitting things up, then you start having the stuff I was talking about yesterday, right? Is bottlenecks and delays and miscommunication, all the things that happen when you have multiple groups trying to talk to each other that are not doing that on a daily basis. So I'm a big fan of teams that have all the skills necessary to do the work, rather than separate teams, one for each skill.
So we are talking about the structure of the teams, and we've brought out some very relevant points about communication and about how people cannot be siloed. The next question talks that from kind of a data perspective and not a people perspective. So the question goes, data value is dependent on data quality. How do we ensure the quality of data? I mean, we saw one of the presentations where the presenter was talking about the stages before you get the value out of data. So that's extraction, cleaning up of data, organizing it, and then doing some data mining or business intelligence reporting out of it to bring out the data value. So the hard bit, the first part, 80% of the section about data mining and cleaning up, if that's not good, then you're not going to get a good data output. So how do we ensure quality of data?
I guess I have opinions on this. I was just talking about this to a group like 3 days ago. So I think one of the big problems with the data quality conversation right now is that we almost universally frame it in the negative. Like, our data quality is terrible, people don't trust the data, we complain about it. Data engineers complain about software people complain about data engineers being hard to work with. And a company that's inspired me is Toyota. So Toyota, I think right now is the second most valuable car manufacturer in the world. They pride themselves on quality, and they sell quality to their customers. They develop quality processes with their suppliers, and for them, quality is framed in the positive. And it's a constant goal and something you're always trying to improve. And I think if we develop that kind of mentality in data and a collaboration mentality on quality, and the idea that that data quality will lead to a better business, a more successful business, then we'll actually be more successful in achieving quality.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
Any other thoughts on this question, or shall we go on to a next one, which also I find really interesting, and I don't know the answer to this. So I'm going to go on to the next question. Here, as a data scientist, how much data engineering should I learn? Do I need to know more than the fundamentals of data engineering?
If you ask this to my team members, they sometimes love it, they sometimes hate it. But we have a phrase in our team saying, "We're all our little data engineer," and yeah, I don't know. I think it helps if you know your basics, even if you are in a machine learning engineer, data scientist, data
it
analyst
helps
role.
if you know, but the question is, do I need to know? How much do I need to know?
Well,
How much?
Yeah, in the very recent past, I had a bunch of conversations with, actually, let me frame it differently. So approach people, or they approach me, and we are exchanging ideas about what we do and all of that. And sometimes when I explain, I'm more at the storage level, the kind of stuff that I do now. And when I explain what I do, they say, "Oh, I don't understand that. I'm a data scientist." And that strikes me as weird, to be honest. Because you don't have to know everything, but if you're in the data space, being that separated, this clear separation between data science and data engineering, I find it odd. It's not that you have to know the whole deal about data engineering, but I guess you have to know something so that you can understand what a data engineer is talking about. But how much is that you need to know? I don't know. I cannot quantify it. But
One of the things that I think about is the idea of ensemble programming, or mob programming. And when you're working in an ensemble, you have a group of people that are literally working at the same computer if you're co-located, and if you're not, working at a virtual version of a shared computer. And a lot of people say, well, that's just 5 people sitting around and watching one person work, but what it really is 5 people working while one person takes notes in the code. And in the process of doing that, you learn from everybody around you. And so no matter where you start, if you're really working collaboratively, you end up learning more. And you also learn about all of the other disciplines that are going into producing the code. So if you put a data scientist and an architect and a couple of devs and a product person all together on the team, you will all gradually start to learn about each other's disciplines, and that's really, really valuable. So you're all contributing, you all have a specialty, but you're also learning the other people's specialties so you can contribute better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I like this idea of getting people in the same room. In a larger organization, the data scientists probably need to know all about how to run these systems, but they should be able to understand how they work and have a conversation. Yeah. And that means teams working together, and it also means like getting coffee or lunch so that you have these conversations and say, talk about projects and things. I think often what happens is if you get the data engineers and the data scientists and the business people together, they come up with ideas they would not develop independently.
Yeah.
Ellissa, the point that you were starting earlier about talking about your team and this question.
Yeah, but I think it aligns with what the rest says. So I think it makes sense that at least you understand the concepts up to a level that you can discuss. But in the end, what is a data engineer? I think it's really looking at different companies. It's such a broad skill set. In the end, it's all about being a good software engineer, knowing your databases, knowing your cloud, and yeah, it can mean so many things in different companies. Know at least from the helicopter view how it touches all these things, and I think that's the minimal you need to know.
I hope that answered your question about data scientists and how deep do you need to go into data engineering?
otherwise, ask again.
Huh?
Otherwise, ask again.
Yeah. Perfect. There is kind of a annex to that question, but I have a higher voted question here, so I'm gonna start with that anyways. So what is the best way to get teams to have a data-driven mentality? This is more of a, I don't know, evangelical.
Those are trigger words for me.
Those
'Cause
are
I don't
trigger
think
words for you?
I don't think a team should have a data-driven mentality. I think it's a dysfunction if they do. Because it's not about the what
I
we're
have
doing.
a feeling that everyone on the stage has a different opinion about
No,
this, so let's hear it
what
out.
we're doing ultimately is helping a user solve their own problems. Right? What a program does, what a good program does, is it helps our customers, our end users, do something that is valuable to them. And that's where the focus has to be. So when you think of it that way, if you start at the customer and work down towards the code, then the data architecture and so forth, that's all enabling other layers of the system to be able to do their work effectively. So data is not driving this. What's driving this is the customer. And that affects things like the data architecture. Because if the architecture aligns with the architecture of the customer's domain, then it will be much, much easier to incorporate the data into a program whose architecture also aligns with the customer's domain. And what I'm trying to avoid here is people focusing just on the data, and what ends up happening is you have a lot of complexity and a lot of stuff in there that doesn't need to be there. And I would rather start at the customer and work my way down.
So quite frankly, I think there are multiple, at least I can see multiple interpretations to the question. I think one possible interpretation, in addition to what Alan was just discussing, is should decisions made within the team be informed by data? In which case, I would say by all means, because a lot of times decisions taken in the team, they are of gut feeling or experience, or I have heard this before. And so whatever can be, supported by data points, it's definitely a good thing.
Well, if you can come up with a metric that means anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, we talk about customer value. There's no metric for value. Right, we talk about productivity. I don't know any metrics for productivity either. Right, so it's nice to be data-driven, but it's a mistake to think that you're data-driven when the data is worthless. But it doesn't really have a connection to what you're trying to measure.
I personally have seen quite a struggle, like basically forcing data-driven is either top-down or it coming more naturally bottom-up is also a sort of thing that I've seen in some companies. So if there's some problems and you can clearly solve them by looking at some data and then drawing some conclusions, bottom-up, that will naturally pop up. And then depending on whoever is the leaders of your company, top-down, there will also be forced certain things upon the teams or upon the colleagues. Okay. Yeah, but it really depends how you then roll it out and how you really embed it into your processes and govern those data-driven decision-making into the teams. Otherwise, it starts to feel really artificial and it's forced, so to say.
And may not necessarily lead to the value that the end objective of your project needs.
Yes.
In order to be for it to be successful. Yeah, maybe you have a successful data design, but the overall outcome is not what we work towards. I am conscious of time, that we are almost at the end of this 30 minutes. I think we are going to wrap up this session. Of course, our speakers are available for you to further ask questions. I can see a lot of questions on this chat that I could not get to. There is a reason for it, the time limitation, but then please give a big round of applause to all our speakers on stage. Ellissa, Matt, Alan, and Flavio. Thank you very much. It was very interactive, and give a big round of applause for yourself. You made it absolutely interactive and interesting.